The salt flats were glowing white under noon sun, and Jeffrey Barkas had maybe 18 hours before German reconnaissance aircraft would photograph the positions he was trying to conceal. He crouched behind a rocky outcrop, watching his camouflage teams spray paint and position canvas sheets across 3 square kilometers of desert, trying to transform real water supply depot into convincing salt flat, while simultaneously creating false salt flat 2 kilometers south that would draw Rommel's panzers away from actual positions. The deception had to work perfectly on first attempt, because German photo analysts would compare today's reconnaissance images against yesterday's photographs, and any inconsistency would reveal the entire operation as fraud, would expose British water supplies to panzer attack that could cripple 8th Army operations across entire North African theater. Water was everything in desert warfare, and both sides knew it with precision that made supply protection more critical than armor or artillery. Tanks could maneuver without fuel for short distances, but soldiers couldn't survive without water for more than 2 days in temperatures that routinely exceeded 45 degrees Celsius. The British depot Barkas was trying to conceal held 30,000 gallons of water stored in underground tanks that supplied 3 divisions operating between El Alamein and Tobruk. If Rommel discovered the depot's location, German artillery would destroy it within hours, and British forces would face choice between retreat or death from dehydration before combat even occurred. The depot couldn't be moved because relocating 30,000 gallons required transport capacity that didn't exist, couldn't be defended because defensive positions would reveal exactly what Barkas was trying to hide, could only be protected through camouflage sophisticated enough to deceive aerial reconnaissance that examined every square meter of desert, looking for exactly these kinds of strategic targets. Barkas had been recruited into military camouflage work because his civilian career as film set designer had taught him how to create visual illusions that cameras would record convincingly. The British Army had realized that camouflage was essentially theatrical design applied to military context, was problem of making objects appear to be something other than what they actually were when observed from specific vantage points. Film designers understood perspective and lighting and material properties that would photograph correctly even when they looked artificial in person. Barkas had used those skills to conceal supply dumps and artillery positions, and now was attempting his most ambitious deception yet, creating false geography that would redirect enemy maneuver away from real installations. The technique depended on understanding how aerial reconnaissance photography transformed 3-dimensional desert into 2-dimensional images that photo analysts would interpret. Salt flats appeared in aerial photographs as bright white irregular patches that contrasted sharply with surrounding sand and rock. The brightness came from salt crystals reflecting sunlight with intensity that photographic film recorded as near white, regardless of actual ground conditions. Barkas had discovered that spray painting canvas with titanium white paint and positioning the canvas to catch sunlight at correct angles would produce photographic signatures nearly identical to real salt flats. The deception wouldn't fool ground observers who could see canvas edges and paint texture, but from 3,000 meters altitude where German reconnaissance aircraft operated, the false flats would photograph as genuine geological features. The operational challenge was creating false salt flat, convincing enough to appear natural, while simultaneously concealing the real water depot that Germans definitely would target if they detected it. Barkas was essentially running 2 separate camouflage operations simultaneously with same deadline: make real installation invisible and make false installation look authentic. The operations had to succeed together because German photo analysts compared images looking for changes that indicated new installations or concealed existing ones. If the false flat appeared but the depot didn't disappear from photographs, analysts would suspect deception. If the depot vanished but no plausible explanation existed for where it had gone, Analysts would assume camouflage and would direct ground reconnaissance to investigate the area thoroughly. Barkas's solution was creating narrative that aerial photographs would tell. The depot had been relocated because ground conditions had deteriorated into salt flat, unsuitable for vehicle operations. German analysts knew that desert surfaces could change rapidly when seasonal water tables rose and dissolved subsurface salt deposits. If reconnaissance showed new salt flat exactly where depot had been located, analysts might conclude that British had abandoned the position due to ground instability rather than suspect elaborate deception. The narrative wouldn't withstand close inspection, but it might survive the 30 seconds of attention that photo analysts could devote to any single location when examining hundreds of square kilometers of desert imagery daily. His camouflage teams were working with desperate speed that came from understanding that German reconnaissance operated on predictable schedule. Morning flights photographed forward positions. Afternoon flights covered logistics areas behind front lines. Evening flights captured any movement that occurred during cooler hours. The depot was photographed every third day as part of routine coverage that monitored British supply infrastructure. Yesterday's flight had occurred on schedule, which meant today's work had to be completed before tomorrow afternoon, when the next reconnaissance would capture whatever Barkas had managed to accomplish. 18 hours to transform geography in ways that would deceive cameras and analysts who were trained specifically to spot exactly this kind of manipulation. The false salt flat was taking shape faster than Barkas had expected because his teams had practiced the technique on smaller installations and had developed efficient procedures for positioning canvas and applying paint with consistency that produced uniform photographic signatures. The challenge wasn't creating individual elements, but creating them at scale that would appear natural rather than manufactured. Real salt flats had irregular boundaries and subtle variations in brightness that came from different salt crystal densities and moisture content. Barkas had to replicate those irregularities artificially by varying his paint mixture and canvas positioning in ways that would photograph as natural geological variation rather than obvious human construction. The real depot concealment was proving more difficult because underground water tanks had above-ground pumping equipment and access hatches that created shadows and geometric patterns visible in aerial photographs. Barkas couldn't remove the equipment because the depot needed to remain operational. Water was being pumped continuously to supply units in forward positions, but he needed to make the equipment photographically invisible to observers examining images from altitude. His solution was constructing false terrain that incorporated the depot's actual geometry while appearing to be natural rock formations. He positioned boulders and painted canvas to create shadow patterns that matched the depot's actual shadows, making the man-made installation appear to be a natural feature that had always been present in this location. The technique was working, but was consuming materials faster than Barkas had calculated. Canvas was rationed commodity in desert theater, where everything from tents to vehicle covers required the same material, and paint was scarce because supply chains prioritized ammunition and fuel over camouflage supplies. Barkas had requisitioned enough material for his operation, but was discovering that theoretical requirements underestimated practical consumption when working at this scale. He was making decisions in real time about which elements could be eliminated and which were essential for photographic deception, was cutting corners that might or might not compromise the final result, was gambling that incomplete perfection would be sufficient to deceive analysts who weren't expecting deception at this location. Sunset brought temporary relief from heat, but also brought time pressure that was becoming critical. Barkas had 10 hours of darkness to complete work that probably required 14 hours, had to finish before dawn, because daylight would make the teams visible to any German patrol aircraft that happened to transit the area, Working at night was slower because precise positioning required visibility that moonlight couldn't provide adequately, because paint dried differently in cooler temperatures and might not achieve the reflective properties that daylight application would produce. He ordered additional lights positioned around work areas, despite knowing that lights created security risk. German patrols occasionally operated this far behind British lines, and unexplained illumination in desert would draw investigation that could compromise the entire operation. The teams worked through darkness with efficiency born from desperation and understanding that incomplete camouflage might be worse than no camouflage at all. If the deception was obviously artificial, German analysts would recognize British attempt at concealment and would direct intensive reconnaissance to discover what was being hidden. Better to have no camouflage and hope the depot was overlooked than to have obvious camouflage that would trigger exactly the investigation Barkas was trying to prevent. The standard wasn't perfection, but believability measured against photo analysts' expectations and available attention. German intelligence examined thousands of images daily and couldn't scrutinize every location thoroughly. Barkas's deceptions needed to be good enough to pass quick examination without triggering deeper investigation. Dawn arrived, and the work was approximately 80% complete, measured against Barkas's original specifications. The false salt flat looked convincing from ground level, but ground level wasn't what mattered. Only aerial photography mattered, and that wouldn't be testable until German reconnaissance returned this afternoon. The real depot concealment was less complete than Barkas wanted, still showed geometric patterns that careful analysis might identify as artificial, but time was exhausted and teams needed to evacuate before daylight made them visible. He ordered withdrawal to positions 5 kilometers distant where teams could observe without being detected, where they could wait through morning hours until reconnaissance flight would either validate or invalidate 18 hours of desperate work. The waiting was harder psychologically than the work had been. During construction, Barkas could focus on immediate problems that required immediate solutions, could channel anxiety into action that felt productive even when he wasn't certain it would succeed. Waiting meant nothing except watching sky and anticipating reconnaissance aircraft that would determine whether his deceptions had worked. He tried to evaluate his camouflage from ground perspective, but ground perspective was misleading. Installations that looked artificial from horizontal viewpoint often appeared natural from aerial oblique, while installations that seemed perfect from ground sometimes revealed obvious patterns when photographed from altitude. German reconnaissance arrived at 1400 hours exactly as Barkas had predicted, twin-engine aircraft transiting the area at 3,000 meters altitude, with cameras recording everything below. Barkas watched through binoculars as the aircraft passed directly over both the false salt flat and the concealed depot, watched it bank slightly to capture better angles, watched it continue toward British forward positions without circling back for additional photography. The lack of circling was positive sign. If analysts monitoring real-time transmission had spotted something suspicious, they would have directed pilot to capture additional images for verification. Single Pass suggested routine photography that hadn't revealed anything requiring immediate attention, but routine photography would still be analyzed in detail back at German intelligence headquarters, would be compared against previous images to identify any changes worth investigating. Barkas wouldn't know if his deceptions had truly worked until German response became apparent over subsequent days. If panzers maneuvered toward the false salt flat, the deception had succeeded. If German artillery targeted the real depot location, the deception had failed, and Barkas had wasted 18 hours and scarce materials on camouflage that had been penetrated immediately. The uncertainty was operational reality that camouflage officers learned to accept. You created deceptions and waited to see if enemy behavior suggested they had been fooled, never knowing with certainty whether success was due to good camouflage or whether enemy simply hadn't been looking in right direction. 3 days passed without German action against the depot, and Barkas began cautiously believing the deception might have worked. On the fourth day, British intelligence intercepted German radio traffic discussing movement orders that referenced avoiding salt flats in the sector where Barkas had created his false geography. The reference wasn't conclusive proof that Germans had been deceived. They might be avoiding the area for unrelated tactical reasons. But it suggested German planning was accounting for terrain features that included Barkas's artificial salt flat, as if it were a legitimate geographical obstacle. The intelligence intercept was fragmentary and ambiguous, but it was evidence that Germans were treating false terrain as real terrain, were incorporating Barkas's deception into their operational planning without recognizing it as deception. The confirmation came 2 weeks later when German Panzer Reconnaissance Unit attempted to traverse area south of the false salt flat and became bogged down in actual soft sand that Germans hadn't anticipated because they had been routing around what they believed was Salt Flat to the north. The British ambush that followed destroyed 3 panzers and captured intelligence documents showing German maps marked Barkas's false salt flat as confirmed terrain feature that reconnaissance had identified through aerial photography. The maps proved the deception had worked at level beyond what Barkas had hoped. Not only had Germans failed to detect the real depot, they had incorporated false salt flat into their tactical planning as verified geographical feature that would influence maneuver decisions. The success meant Barkas's technique could be replicated at other critical installations that required protection from aerial reconnaissance. British camouflage operations began systematic program of creating false terrain features throughout North African theater. False salt flats, false rock formations, false wadis that appeared to be impassable obstacles but were actually traversable routes. The deceptions created geographical uncertainty that complicated German planning, made their maps less reliable, forced them to allocate reconnaissance resources to verify terrain that appeared obvious in aerial photographs but might be artificial. The cumulative effect wasn't dramatic single victory, but persistent degradation of German intelligence confidence that made their operations less efficient and more hesitant. Barkas documented his technique in technical manual that was distributed to camouflage units throughout British forces, that explained material requirements and positioning procedures and photographic principles that made the deceptions work. The manual emphasized understanding perspective and lighting rather than just following procedures, emphasized that successful camouflage required thinking like photo analyst to understand what observers would notice and what they would dismiss as unremarkable. The educational approach produced camouflage officers who could adapt techniques to different situations rather than just repeating standard methods, who could improvise solutions to unique challenges that manual couldn't anticipate. The technique's limitations became apparent as German photo analysis procedures improved in response to detected deceptions. German analysts began applying heightened scrutiny to installations that showed sudden terrain changes, began cross-referencing multiple reconnaissance flights to detect inconsistencies that single-flight analysis would miss, began directing ground reconnaissance to verify suspicious features that aerial photography couldn't definitively classify. The cat-and-mouse game between camouflage and detection escalated throughout North African campaign, with each side developing countermeasures to the other side's innovations. Barkas responded by making his deceptions more subtle and more integrated with actual terrain. Instead of creating obvious false salt flats, he created ambiguous features that could be interpreted either as natural geology or as human construction, depending on how much attention analysts devoted to examination. Instead of completely concealing installations, he created partial camouflage that made installations look abandoned or damaged rather than operational. The subtle approaches were harder to implement and required more skilled personnel, but they were more resistant to detection because they didn't trigger the obvious artificiality that alerted analysts to potential deception. The water depot that Barkas had originally concealed remained undiscovered by Germans throughout North African campaign, continued supplying British forces through battles that determined control of region. The depot's survival couldn't be attributed solely to Barkas's camouflage. German reconnaissance might have missed it for reasons unrelated to deception, but the consistent failure to target installation that was strategically significant suggested camouflage had been at least partially effective at preventing detection. The depot became test case for expanded camouflage operations that protected other installations using similar techniques adapted to their specific situations. Rommel's forces never learned about the false salt flat or about the systematic deception campaign that had created false geography throughout theater. German intelligence recognized that British camouflage was effective, but didn't understand the extent to which their tactical maps included artificial terrain features that existed only in photographs and in intelligence reports based on those photographs. The deception's success depended partially on German expectations that terrain was objective fact rather than potentially manipulable perception. That geological features verified through aerial photography were reliable because cameras didn't lie. Barkas had demonstrated that cameras could be made to lie if you understood what cameras recorded and how human observers interpreted those recordings. After North African campaign concluded with Axis defeat, Barkas continued developing camouflage techniques for European theater, where terrain and operational conditions required different approaches than desert warfare. The principles remained applicable: understand observer perspective, manipulate what observers would see, create narratives that made deception seem natural. But implementation changed dramatically when transitioning from open desert to European countryside with vegetation and buildings and complex terrain that provided both challenges and opportunities for concealment. Barkas adapted his desert techniques to European conditions, developed new methods for concealing installations in forests and farmland, trained new camouflage units in principles that transcended specific geographical contexts. The false salt flat technique became obsolete as aerial reconnaissance technology improved and as photo analysis procedures became more sophisticated. Post-war reconnaissance using multiple wavelengths and stereophotography could detect canvas and paint through spectral signatures and shadow analysis that wartime photography couldn't capture. The technique had worked because it exploited specific technological limitations that existed in 1942, but which didn't persist through rapid wartime innovation that made reconnaissance increasingly difficult to deceive. Barkas's innovation was temporally specific, was valuable during window when technology hadn't yet closed the gaps that deception could exploit. Barkas himself survived the war and returned to film industry, where his military camouflage experience influenced his approach to set design and visual effects. He had learned that convincing illusions required understanding observer psychology as much as understanding physical materials, that deception succeeded when it aligned with expectations rather than when it achieved objective perfection. The lessons transferred reasonably well to entertainment context, where audiences needed to be convinced temporarily rather than deceived permanently, where suspension of disbelief was collaborative rather than adversarial. His post-war work never achieved prominence that some other set designers reached, but it was professionally successful and personally satisfying in ways military service hadn't been. He rarely discussed his camouflage work publicly because military deception remained classified long after the war's conclusion, because intelligence services wanted to preserve techniques that might be relevant in future conflicts. When British government finally declassified camouflage operations in 1970s, Barkas was interviewed about his innovations, but found that public interest in military deception was minimal compared to interest in combat operations and strategic decisions. Camouflage was viewed as technical specialty rather than critical military capability, was interesting historical footnote rather than significant factor in campaign outcomes. The perception disappointed Barkas because he believed camouflage had saved more lives than its recognition suggested, had prevented battles through successful concealment rather than winning battles through superior combat performance. The water depot he had concealed was demolished after the war when British forces withdrew from North Africa and regional governments assumed control of infrastructure. The underground tanks were filled with sand, and the above-ground equipment was removed for salvage, eliminating physical evidence that installation had ever existed at that location. The false salt flat had weathered away within months of its creation as canvas deteriorated and paint faded under desert sun and wind, had returned to being ordinary desert, indistinguishable from surrounding terrain. The entire deception existed only in photographs and reports and memories that gradually faded as participants aged and died and took their experiences with them. British military doctrine incorporated Barkas's lessons about terrain deception into camouflage training that continued through Cold War decades. The specific techniques became obsolete, but the underlying principles remained relevant. Understand how observers gather information, manipulate what they will see, create plausible narratives that make deceptions seem natural. The principles applied to different technologies and different conflicts, but the fundamental insight remained valid that perception could be manipulated if you understood perception's mechanisms and limitations. German military analysis after the war revealed how extensively British camouflage had degraded their intelligence confidence during North African campaign. German commanders had made tactical decisions based on terrain assessments that included false features, had allocated resources to defend against threats that didn't exist, had failed to detect installations that were strategically significant. The intelligence failures hadn't been decisive individually, but had accumulated into systematic uncertainty that made German operations less efficient and more reactive. British camouflage hadn't won North African campaign, but had contributed to conditions that made British victory more achievable by degrading German advantages that superior tactics and equipment had provided early in the campaign. Barkas died in 1977 without receiving formal recognition for his camouflage innovations beyond citations that remained classified during his lifetime. His obituary mentioned film career and military service without specifying his role in developing terrain deception techniques that had protected critical installations throughout North African campaign. The lack of recognition was typical for military specialists whose contributions were technical rather than heroic, whose successes prevented battles rather than winning them, whose work was necessarily obscure because publicity would have revealed techniques that military wanted to preserve for future use. The false salt flat he created that night survived in German intelligence photographs that were captured after war and eventually declassified. The photographs show bright white irregular patch exactly where Barkas had positioned his canvas and paint, show terrain feature that appears completely natural in images despite being entirely artificial construction. The photographs are preserved in military archives as examples of successful deception operations, are studied by camouflage specialists and intelligence analysts who want to understand how visual perception can be manipulated through understanding of photographic processes and human interpretation. Modern satellite reconnaissance would detect Barkas's deceptions immediately through multispectral imaging and synthetic aperture radar and other technologies that weren't available during World War II. The canvas and paint that fooled photographic film would show completely different signatures in infrared and radar wavelengths, would reveal themselves as artificial through spectral analysis that wartime reconnaissance couldn't perform. But in 1942, Barkas's technique exploited cutting-edge reconnaissance technology's limitations, used understanding of how cameras recorded visible light to create illusions that observers couldn't penetrate without ground verification that operational conditions usually didn't permit. The water depot continued operating undetected throughout remainder of North African campaign, supplied British forces during battles at El Alamein, and during pursuit of retreating German forces across Libya. The depot's survival was strategic success that couldn't be measured in destroyed enemy units or captured territory, but which enabled operations that achieved those measurable outcomes. Barkas's camouflage had protected infrastructure that made other British successes possible, had prevented German interdiction that would have forced British operational changes that might have altered campaign outcomes. The contribution was indirect and difficult to quantify, but was nonetheless significant for operations that depended on water supply remaining secure and uninterrupted. The technique required resources that became increasingly scarce as war progressed and as supply priorities shifted toward direct combat support rather than defensive camouflage. Canvas and paint were diverted to other uses, and camouflage operations had to accomplish more with less material, had to develop techniques that were less resource-intensive while remaining effective against improving German reconnaissance. Barkas adapted by using natural materials more extensively, actual rocks and sand positioned to create shadows rather than canvas painted to simulate those features. But natural materials required more labor and more time to position correctly, made camouflage operations slower and more dependent on available personnel. The evolution of camouflage techniques throughout war reflected broader pattern where initial innovations worked until countermeasures were developed, forcing new innovations that would work until they, too, were countered. The cycle continued throughout conflict with neither side achieving permanent advantage, but both sides driving technological and tactical evolution that made warfare progressively more complex. Barkas's false salt flat was one iteration in ongoing competition between concealment and detection that continued long after the specific techniques he developed became obsolete. His contribution to British victory in North Africa was one component among many that made success achievable. Strategic decisions and tactical excellence and resource advantages and intelligence breakthroughs all mattered more than camouflage in determining campaign outcomes. But camouflage mattered nonetheless, because wars were won through accumulation of small advantages that made larger operations possible, because protecting infrastructure was as important as destroying enemy capabilities, because preventing losses was as valuable as achieving gains, even though preventing losses generated less recognition than achieving gains. The 18 hours Barkas spent creating false salt flat and concealing water depot represented microcosm of larger camouflage campaign that protected installations throughout North African theater. The work was tedious and technical rather than dramatic or heroic, was problem-solving under time pressure rather than combat under fire, was contribution that military historians would struggle to evaluate because its success was measured in attacks that didn't happen rather than in battles that were won. But for the British soldiers who drank water from the depot that Rommel never discovered, for the units that remained combat effective because their water supply remained secure, Barkas's camouflage was difference between operational capability and forced withdrawal that would have changed strategic situations in ways that cascade through military campaigns in unpredictable directions. The technical manual Barkas wrote documenting his salt flat deception technique was studied intensively by Allied camouflage units preparing for operations in other theaters. The Pacific Theater presented completely different challenges, where jungle vegetation provided natural concealment, but where humidity destroyed canvas and paint within weeks, where creating false terrain required different materials and different approaches than desert conditions had demanded. European theater operations required camouflage that integrated with agricultural landscapes and urban environments, required techniques for concealing installations among buildings and hedgerows rather than in open terrain where any artificial feature stood out dramatically. The adaptation process revealed both strengths and limitations of Barkas's approach. His emphasis on understanding observer perspective translated well across different environments, whether deceiving aerial reconnaissance over desert or forest or farmland. The fundamental requirement remained understanding how cameras recorded terrain and how analysts interpreted those recordings. But his specific techniques using canvas and paint proved difficult to replicate in climates where materials deteriorated rapidly or where terrain complexity made large-scale constructions impractical. Camouflage officers had to extract principles from Barkas's desert work and develop new implementations appropriate to their specific operational conditions. The water depot survived not just German reconnaissance, but also the complex logistics of desert warfare that made water supply extraordinarily vulnerable to interdiction. German long-range patrols occasionally penetrated deep behind British lines, searching for exactly these kinds of supply installations, searching for targets that could be destroyed through commando raids rather than requiring major military operations. The depot's location was chosen partially because surrounding terrain made ground approaches difficult, but terrain advantage was meaningless if aerial reconnaissance revealed the depot's existence and directed ground forces to attack it. Barkas's camouflage protected against the reconnaissance that would have enabled the raids, prevented the intelligence collection that would have made the depot vulnerable to attack methods that direct defense couldn't have stopped. The relationship between camouflage and broader military operations was complex and often misunderstood by commanders who viewed concealment as defensive measure rather than offensive enabler. Barkas repeatedly argued that effective camouflage wasn't about hiding from enemy, but about controlling what enemy believed they knew, about creating false certainty that would lead to poor decisions. The false salt flat didn't just conceal the depot, it created geographic feature that Germans incorporated into their planning, that influenced their maneuver decisions, that made certain tactical approaches seem unviable because terrain appeared unsuitable. The deception was active contribution to British operational capability rather than passive protection of existing assets. This conceptual shift from passive concealment to active deception represented evolution in camouflage thinking that Barkas helped pioneer. Early war camouflage had focused primarily on making objects difficult to see, painting equipment to match surroundings, positioning installations in shadows, using natural features to break up geometric patterns that cameras would recognize as human construction. Barkas advocated for ambitious approach where camouflage created false reality rather than just obscuring actual reality, where enemy observers would see something that influenced their decisions rather than seeing nothing and remaining uncertain about what might be present. The approach required different skills and different organizational support than traditional camouflage. Creating convincing false terrain required understanding geology and how natural features formed, required materials and labor that were difficult to justify when compared to conventional military expenditures, required time that operational pressures often didn't allow. Barkas fought continuous bureaucratic battles to secure resources for camouflage operations that senior officers viewed as peripheral to actual combat operations, fought to maintain priority for activities that showed results only through enemy actions that didn't occur rather than through measurable battlefield successes. The validation came incrementally through intelligence intercepts and captured documents that revealed German planning had been influenced by features that British camouflage had created. Each discovery strengthened the case for continued camouflage investment, demonstrated that deception was producing operational effects that justified its resource consumption. But the validation was never complete enough to eliminate skepticism from commanders who instinctively valued offensive operations over defensive deception, who measured military effectiveness through enemy casualties and captured territory rather than through preserved friendly capabilities and degraded enemy intelligence. Barkas's teams expanded beyond the initial water depot deception to create systematic false geography throughout British-controlled areas of North Africa. They constructed false vehicle parks that suggested British armor was concentrated in locations where only empty desert existed, created false supply dumps that drew German bombing away from actual logistics installations, built false fortifications that suggested defensive preparations in areas where British actually planned offensive operations. The cumulative deception created operational uncertainty that complicated German planning at every level, from tactical maneuver to strategic resource allocation. The German response evolved as they recognized the extent of British deception operations. German photo analysts began applying systematic skepticism to any terrain features that appeared suddenly or that seemed inconsistent with surrounding geography, began requiring multiple reconnaissance confirmations before accepting features as verified, began directing ground reconnaissance to investigate suspicious areas that aerial photography couldn't definitively classify. The countermeasures were effective but expensive. Requiring multiple reconnaissance flights consumed aircraft and pilot hours that could have been used for other intelligence collection. Requiring ground verification exposed reconnaissance units to ambush and capture that provided British with intelligence about German concerns and capabilities. The escalating cycle of deception and counter-deception became arms race where neither side achieved permanent advantage, but both sides drove increasing sophistication in camouflage techniques and reconnaissance procedures. Barkas had to make his deceptions progressively more subtle and more integrated with actual terrain as German analysts became better at detecting artificial features. He began using actual geological materials, real salt transported from distant flats, actual rock formations repositioned to create false geographic patterns, because artificial materials were becoming too easy to detect through improved photographic analysis, and because natural materials were inherently more resistant to detection than manufactured substitutes. The labor requirements for natural material deception were substantially higher than canvas and paint approaches, required engineering units to move tons of rock and salt to create features that previous techniques had simulated with lightweight materials. The resource demands created tension with other military requirements that competed for same engineering assets and same transportation capacity. Barkas had to justify each major deception operation through detailed analysis, showing probable German response and likely operational benefits, had to demonstrate that preventing enemy action through deception was more efficient than responding to enemy action through direct military engagement. The analysis was necessarily speculative because measuring deception's effectiveness required estimating what would have happened without the deception, counterfactual reasoning that produced uncertain conclusions rather than definitive proof. Barkas developed methodologies for evaluating deception effectiveness through intelligence intercepts and captured documents and observed enemy behavior, developed frameworks for assessing probability that German actions had been influenced by British camouflage. The methodologies were imperfect, but they provided sufficient evidence that senior commanders generally accepted camouflage operations as legitimate military capability, worth continued investment, despite persistent skepticism about specific operations. The water depot that had prompted Barkas's initial false salt flat deception became test case for evaluating long-term camouflage effectiveness. The depot remained undiscovered throughout the entire North African campaign, despite being photographed by German reconnaissance multiple times per week, despite being located in an area where German intelligence knew British water supplies must exist because operational mathematics required certain supply capacity to support observed British force levels. The persistent failure to detect installation that should have been obvious priority target suggested camouflage was working at level beyond what skeptics had believed possible. Post-war analysis of German intelligence records confirmed that the depot's location had never been identified despite German awareness that major water supply must exist somewhere in the sector. German analysts had noted the salt flat that Barkas created and had concluded the area was unsuitable for installation siting, had directed reconnaissance attention to other locations where terrain seemed more appropriate for supply depot construction. The false geography had worked exactly as Barkas intended, not by making the depot invisible, but by creating plausible explanation for why depot wouldn't be located in that specific area, by channeling German analytical attention toward locations where nothing existed while protecting location where critical installation actually operated. The success validated Barkas's theoretical framework that effective deception required understanding enemy analytical processes and providing information that would lead to incorrect but plausible conclusions. The approach required sophisticated understanding of how intelligence organizations processed information and made assessments, required ability to predict what enemy analysts would consider plausible versus what they would consider suspicious. Barkas had essentially been conducting psychological operations targeting German intelligence personnel specifically, had been manipulating their perception through carefully constructed information that aligned with their expectations and analytical frameworks. The psychological dimension of camouflage operations became increasingly important as the war progressed and as both sides became more sophisticated about deception. Simple visual concealment became less effective as reconnaissance technology improved, while psychological operations that shaped how observers interpreted what they saw remained effective even against improved technology. Barkas's emphasis on narrative, creating stories that aerial photographs would tell, represented transition toward information operations that would become increasingly central to military operations in subsequent decades. His influence extended beyond his direct operations, through the officers he trained and the doctrine he helped develop. British camouflage training emphasized creative problem-solving and understanding of perception psychology rather than rote application of standard techniques, emphasized principles that could be adapted to novel situations rather than procedures that worked only in specific contexts. The educational approach produced camouflage officers who continued innovating throughout the war and who carried those approaches into post-war military service, where deception remained relevant even as specific technologies and tactics evolved. The false salt flat itself existed for only a few months before natural weathering destroyed the canvas and faded the paint, before wind and occasional rain eliminated the artificial feature and restored the area to undistinguished desert. The ephemeral nature of the deception was intentional. Permanent constructions would have required maintenance that might be detected and would have created long-term features that changing operational conditions might make counterproductive. Temporary deceptions could be created quickly and abandoned without consequences, could be adapted to immediate tactical requirements without worrying about long-term consistency that permanent features would demand. The technique's temporary nature also meant that physical evidence of most camouflage operations disappeared completely within months of their creation, leaving only photographs and written records to document what had been accomplished. The lack of physical evidence made post-war historical analysis difficult and made camouflage contributions easy to underestimate compared to operations that left lasting physical traces through destroyed equipment and altered geography. Barkas's work existed primarily in archives rather than in landscape, existed in intelligence reports and reconnaissance photographs rather than in preserved installations or memorial markers. The water depot was finally shut down months after the North African campaign concluded, when British forces no longer required forward supply installations and when regional security situation made continued operation impractical. The underground tanks were drained and filled with sand to prevent them becoming hazards or being repurposed by groups that British didn't want accessing water supplies in that location. The above-ground equipment was salvaged for use elsewhere or destroyed to prevent potential hostile use. The systematic elimination of evidence was military standard procedure, but it also eliminated physical traces that would have documented the installation's operational history and the camouflage that had protected it. Barkas returned to England after North African victory and was assigned to camouflage planning for European invasion operations. The work differed dramatically from desert camouflage because European landscape provided abundant natural concealment, but also provided Germans with intimate knowledge of terrain that made deception more difficult. Creating false features in French countryside required understanding how German officers, who had occupied the region for years, would interpret changes they observed, required deceptions that would seem plausible to observers who knew the terrain far better than British planners did. The challenge produced different camouflage approaches, where Barkas relied more on exploiting existing features rather than creating entirely new ones, where deception worked by making installations appear to be something else rather than appearing to be nothing. A supply depot might be disguised as farm complex. An armored concentration might be presented as displaced civilian vehicles. A headquarters might be concealed within apparent civilian housing. The techniques required less construction than desert deceptions, but required better understanding of local architecture and agricultural practices and civilian patterns that German observers would consider normal versus suspicious. Barkas's work in European theater was classified more strictly than his desert operations had been because invasion planning required secrecy that North African operations hadn't demanded to same degree. The classification meant his contributions remained unknown publicly for decades. After war's conclusion, meant recognition was limited to military professionals who understood camouflage's operational significance rather than public acknowledgement that would have made his innovations widely known. The delayed recognition was frustrating for Barkas, who believed his work deserved attention comparable to other technical innovations that had contributed to Allied victory. The frustration was tempered by professional satisfaction that came from knowing his techniques had protected installations and saved lives, that his creative problem-solving had produced operational effects that justified the resources invested in camouflage operations. He had transformed military camouflage from reactive concealment to proactive deception, had developed methodologies that influenced British military doctrine for decades after the war, had demonstrated that perception could be manipulated systematically if you understood perception's mechanisms. The accomplishments mattered to him even without public recognition, mattered as professional validation rather than as personal glory. His post-war film career benefited from military experience that had taught him about large-scale project management and about working within resource constraints and about creating visual effects under time pressure. The skills transferred well to commercial film production, where budgets were limited and schedules were demanding, and visual effects needed to convince audiences despite being created with practical materials rather than actual phenomena. Barkas worked on several successful films in 1950s and 1960s, contributed to productions that demonstrated technical expertise without highlighting his military background that remained classified during those decades. The declassification of his military work in 1970s came too late for widespread public recognition. By then, the war had been over for 3 decades, and public attention had moved to contemporary concerns rather than historical operations. Barkas gave several interviews about his camouflage innovations, but found that interviewers were more interested in dramatic stories about combat operations than in technical details about creating false salt flats and concealing water depots. The lack of dramatic narrative made camouflage difficult to explain to civilian audiences who expected war stories to involve heroism and danger rather than careful planning and patient execution of deception operations. He died disappointed that his most significant professional accomplishments remained obscure despite being declassified, that camouflage's contributions to Allied victory were underappreciated compared to combat operations and strategic decisions that received extensive public attention. His obituary mentioned film career prominently and military service briefly, without explaining the innovations he had developed, or the installations he had protected, or the systematic deception campaign he had conducted throughout North African theater. The brevity reflected general public understanding of military camouflage as minor technical specialty rather than significant operational capability that had influenced strategic outcomes.